Persecution and trials. When we face various trials, we should ask God to help us view these painful experiences as opportunities to become more mature in our spiritual walk with Jesus Christ. Here's Gene to explain.
Now, the interesting thing is that James never makes reference here in his letter to the Jerusalem Council, which happened in AD 49. The Jerusalem Council was when they came from, you remember, Antioch of Syria. They couldn't solve the problem of law and grace. The Judaizers who had come from Jerusalem created all those problems. So Paul and Barnabas went down to Jerusalem, met with the apostles, with the elders, and there they talked. Now, it's interesting that James, at that particular time, had already emerged as the lead pastor or elder in the church in Jerusalem. That is the author of this epistle. Later on, in Acts 21, 17, 18, we read, this is when Paul eventually came back to Jerusalem after his third journey. It says, when we reached Jerusalem, the brothers welcomed us gladly. The following day, Paul went in with us to James. This is the one who's the author of this epistle. And then all the elders were present. So James, the half-brother of Jesus, was evidently the lead pastor. Today we use the nomenclature senior pastor, leader, elder of the church there in Jerusalem. Now, the point is that he makes no reference to that council meeting in his letter, which means that this letter was written probably before AD 49. And if this were written before AD 49, then it represents the first letter that is included, as far as chronology is concerned, in the New Testament. This was written before the Thessalonian letters, before Galatians, before the Corinthian letter. We're looking, as we look into this letter, at the first letter that was probably written in the New Testament and is included in the New Testament. So it's a very significant letter and gives us some background. Now, imagine what happened in this whole situation and what happened in these areas. Imagine what would happen. Here were these God-fearing Grecian Jews from all over the New Testament world. This was a sacrificial trip. I mean, they're traveling from all over the Roman world to worship for 50 days. And by the way they did that was they used their second tithe. The first tithe, the first 10%, as it was outlined in the Old Testament, was given to support the synagogues there in their local areas. However, they set aside a second tithe to make that trip to Jerusalem. And that was a 50-day period. So that was sacrificial. And these were dedicated Jews. And all of a sudden, or gradually, these people begin to arrive back in their cities from all over the Roman world, and they come back believers in the Messiah. What about the Jews in their communities that did not become believers? I think the primary persecution that James is referring to is not from the Gentiles per se, but from the Jews themselves, and particularly the Jewish leaders. And so James writes, and he says, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing the testing of your faith produces endurance, but endurance must do its complete work so that you may be mature, complete, lacking nothing." Now, I mentioned earlier that persecution was intense on the part of those who rejected the gospel. And you see that on the first missionary journey with the Apostle Paul and Barnabas. And, for example, when they got to Antioch and Pisidia, there in Acts chapter 13, we have a record of this. Luke gives it to us. He says, "The following Sabbath, almost the whole town assembled to hear the message of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began to oppose what Paul was saying by insulting him." That's persecution. And so here we see some of the persecution that James is probably addressing on the part of the Jewish believers that went back to their hometowns. Another illustration is in Acts 14, verses 1 and 2. The same thing happened in Iconium, Luke records. They entered the Jewish synagogue. They spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up and poisoned the minds of the Gentiles against the brothers. Now here you see the root of the persecution was on the part of the Jews, who then poisoned the minds of the Gentiles, so the persecution came from both groups. And that's probably what happened in these cities that were a part of those Jews who went back to their home cities from all over the Roman Empire. So there you have an illustration of what James is addressing. Here's another illustration, and you want to talk about persecution. Here it is. Acts 14:19. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium. And this is now after Paul and Barnabas were forced to leave Iconium. They went on down to Lystra, which was Timothy's hometown, by the way. And it says some Jews followed them. The Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, where they had persecuted Paul and Barnabas. And when they had won over the crowds, and here the crowds were primarily Gentiles, worshiping, the goddesses of Greece, when they had won over the crowds and stoned Paul, they dragged him out of the city thinking he was dead. So here you have the intensity of the persecution that existed in some of these areas that James was addressing. So with that background in mind, it helps us to really understand what he's talking about. Consider it all joy, he said. Now, I think we need to understand that the joy that James was writing about was certainly not emotional elation, as we sometimes use the word joy. Jump up and down with joy because you're being persecuted. That's what he's talking about. But he's talking rather about the ability and conviction, as it were, to look beyond the problem, beyond the difficulty, and see the opportunity to become more and more like Jesus Christ. Now, that's hard to identify with, isn't it? In our culture particularly. Furthermore, it certainly meant seeing how God could further his work through the problems that they were encountering. So James is addressing this persecution that these individuals were facing. Paul was an excellent illustration of being able to rejoice with this kind of joy in the midst of persecution. An example of that when he was in prison the first time, wrote to the Philippians, and he was being persecuted. People were preaching in order to add to his problems. And he wrote to the Philippians and says, what does it matter? Just that in every way, whether out of false motives or true, Christ is being proclaimed. And in this, what? I rejoice. Why? Well, I rejoice, yes, and I will rejoice because I know this will lead to my deliverance through your prayers and help from the Spirit of Jesus Christ. In actuality, I think what he is saying is that this is drawing me closer to God. I'm trusting God more. I'm coming to know God better. I'm coming to know Jesus Christ. I'm coming to know the power of the Holy Spirit through this persecution. Well, the question, and this is a very thought-provoking question, I think, for those of us particularly who don't understand this. We've never experienced this kind of persecution. And the question is simply, though painful trials and experiences vary greatly in our lives, how have you observed this principle at work in your own life or in the lives of others? Well, first of all, I would have to say that I've never experienced that kind of persecution. But I do know that if I can see some meaning in it for growth, that helps to be able to see this as an opportunity rather than as just a difficulty that drags you down. There's something incredibly significant about that. It's the Romans 8:28 principle that knowing that all things work together for the good for those who love the Lord, those who are called according to his purpose. But, you think about those who have faced the ultimate sacrifice in the midst of persecution. I think of Stephen. I went back and read that passage just today where Stephen was stoned and his face was glowing. And he faced that with incredible courage and strength as he was stoned by those in the Sanhedrin. And of course, at that point, the Apostle Paul wasn't even a believer. And he was a part of the crowd that approved of his death, of his martyrdom. And you read that passage, you say, this is supernatural. And it really puts in your heart and mind that when you face this kind of thing, God will be there for us, to be able to help us to endure that. I think of that, and many times I say, wow, I don't know how they did it. I can't even comprehend it. And yet there are many illustrations of that. I've been reviewing the church fathers. And some of the things that they went through, Ignatius, for example, one of the early church fathers who probably knew the Apostle John, was martyred, was probably torn to bits in the Roman amphitheaters because of his faith. And yet, in the midst of that, stood tall and strong in the midst of all of that. I think of Justin Martyr, who came after Ignatius. And that's why they call him Martyr. His name is Justin. It was Justin Martyr. He was martyred for the cause of Jesus Christ. You read the story of the way he was killed, the way he gave his life for Jesus Christ, the strength that he had. It was like Stephen. And so we have these incredible illustrations, and we can draw strength from them that should we ever have to face that kind of ultimate sacrifice, that God would be there for us. To be able to consider this as joy, not jumping up and down with elation, but as opportunity to see beyond that with a higher purpose in mind. I don't know about you, but that really touches my heart, and I hope that it touches your heart, especially when we think in terms of the fact that, particularly in our culture, that we don't face those kinds of trials, those kinds of difficulties, and yet we do face problems, and if they withstood them, we ought to be able to withstand them with the strength of Jesus Christ.